Alleluia. Om Mani Padme. Om. Allah.
Welcome. You're watching Harmony and Diversity. And again this week we're speaking with Megan Bourke. She's the Community Engagement Coordinator for Schools and Universities with Caritas Australia. Thanks for coming back.
You're very welcome.
Because we have a lot to talk about.
Indeed.
You've got programs in quite a lot of countries. I've got some here: Cambodia, Timor-Leste, Philippines, Tanzania, Malawi, and the Pacific. Fire off on some of those. A bit of action.
Well, this
there.
is I'm really excited to explore these stories with you in these countries. I'm really lucky to have visited our partners there and then been welcomed into many communities in all of those countries and some more. So I did want to just explain to you and your audiences a little bit more about Caritas's work once we're in those countries. And remembering that we have some 13 or more programs with our first Australian peoples as well.
Oh,
so that's not often known either, that yes, we work in 29 different countries overseas, but of course there are vulnerable and marginalised peoples amongst our Australian communities too. So, but just on a couple of examples of our work. Firstly, that all of those programs are underpinned by what we call integral human development, which means that our work and our partners' work is to ensure that all people, and they deserve this as a, if you like, a God-given right, to have a full and beautiful life. And so an integral human development means that we're not just there to promote the economic well-being of a person or a community, but the social and political and spiritual well-being of that community as well.
Right.
And so it's looking at the whole person, the whole dimension of a person and community. We operate with something called a strength-based approach. So when us and our partners move into communities where there is extreme need in a long-term development picture, we are looking for the strengths of a community, not just where their needs are. It's pretty obvious what their needs are. So we look for the assets in that community. What are the physical and social and community assets that they bring to improve their own situation?
Okay.
So we call this a strength-based approach. That is, focusing on people's capacities rather than their incapacities. And they all have great things to offer. So let me explain, for example, how that might work in Cambodia. So we've been to a beautiful community in a region, the Rukiri community, a community of farmers where they're often women, actually. And I don't know if you realise this, but 87% of the world's farmers are, in fact, women.
I didn't.
Anyway, in these particular communities, women have been given training and have been offered opportunities to be the leaders in their own community. They have worm farms, chook poo, all sorts of vegetables growing. Very proudly will show us around their village and describe to us in their own way how their nutrition has been improved and their water and sanitation, the capacity for children to get off to school. So we don't go in and just offer assistance for one component of their life. We like our partners to ensure with their communities that there's a great diversity of programs operating under that integral human development and that they're focusing on the strengths of the community. I've seen this in Timor-Leste over and over again, a country that's known great sadness in very recent times. And again, the communities themselves make the decisions at the very grassroots of how to spend some money that's been donated from Australian communities. and they look for the strengths in that community and make decisions themselves. So you and I can't waltz in there and build a house, Norm.
No.
They know how to do that themselves. And if they don't, they'll make the decision themselves to focus on one or two leaders to go and get that training.
Yes.
In Timor, for one example is that I met a bunch of adolescent young people who'd come from communities all over Timor twice for 2 weeks, several weeks during the year, to learn greater crop propagation techniques. So their communities had decided to bring their young people in.
Yep.
After 2 weeks, those adolescents go back to their communities to distribute that new knowledge and skill set.
Okay.
Caritas doesn't pay for, if you like, experts to go into the village to do the work for them. The people in those communities know exactly how to lift themselves out of poverty. They just need a bit of a hand up from us, and we're in a position to provide the money to do that.
Where does that philosophy come from? That's a very interesting approach. Is it something that Caritas developed themselves, or where does it come from?
A strength-based approach and is not unique to Caritas per se, but it does come out of our Catholic social teachings, which honours the dignity of every human person and honours the common good decisions for a community. And in our part, we stand in solidarity with our brothers and sisters around the world while they're achieving that. So occasionally I get the happy task of going into various countries to listen, to learn and to affirm, but never to teach. They can do all of that themselves. I'm there to say, that's great. What you've achieved is fantastic.
So it's not the great white father or someone coming to help these communities.
Absolutely not. We enter communities with humility and honouring the dignity of those people to improve their own lives. And it's important they do the work. There is great dignity in work. In all settings, but in particularly with people who are very vulnerable and marginalised, like ethnic minorities, for example, or religious minorities. So no, we're not going in there to save them. We're going in to assist and to stand beside.
And what sort of, and we're coming up to a break, so you may not be able to answer it quickly, but what sort of feedback do you get from the communities in relation to this to reinforce the efficacy of it?
Well, they usually love it when we visit, which is terrific. It's a great opportunity for cultural exchange. Feedback from the people in communities overwhelmingly is one of gratitude for a start, but nonetheless, just even for them to be able to express that thanks.
One way you can express thanks is to give people time, and we're out of it. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back. You're watching Harmony and Diversity. We're speaking with Megan Bourke, Community Engagement Coordinator for Schools and Universities with Caritas Australia. And we were covering the various places where you're located, particularly in the Pacific area. But you, what's the breadth of those programs? There's lots of things which need to be covered.
There are, Norm, and remember, whilst there's a lot of need in a community, we focus on the strengths of the community to respond to those needs, or for them to respond to those needs. So the stories, I think, are the richest part of Caritas life, and an example of that is in the Philippines, for example, where there's from the outset, from looking at looking at a picture of Manila, and you'll see, well, this is a thriving, wonderful, modern city. But look below the surface, and you see, great need. So we work along with a partner called the Faithful Companions of Jesus, FCJ, in the rubbish dump areas of Quezon City in Manila, on the outskirts of Manila. Very enterprising people, and people who are lifting themselves out of poverty. But there's an example, as all of our our communities are. They have water and sanitation programs. They have nutrition programs for health. They have programs that enable people to lead with a voice in their community, to become empowered, if you like, on a whole range of areas, so socially, politically, physically, and so on. So in any one program in Caritas, there will be all of those aspects being covered. And it might be, for example, education and literacy might be covered. In the Philippines, we see women, for example, who've been empowered to use local fabrics to make bags and all sorts of things. So we see a lot of different small micro industries or micro enterprises, which in themselves enhance the capacity of women to send their children to school, to put a safe roof over their head, to perhaps combine together to have a community toilet. So keep in mind the decision making sits with them, not with us. Likewise, we have programs in the Pacific, which are largely, at the moment, they're integrated, as I described, but the big concern in the Pacific at the moment, of course, is climate justice. We see this being acted out in East Africa at the moment as well. Only in the Pacific, the concern around climate change is that our brothers and sisters in those neighbourhoods close to us are seeing sea level rise and the inundation of their lands. In drought-stricken East Africa at the moment, crops have failed, 25 million people hungry tonight. But in both those cases, we see great injustices. And so one of the big pillars of Caritas's work in this current time is to fight for climate justice. And for that, we need the whole Australian community to join with us. In an education context, a community education context, we've been running a long campaign to empower the Australian community to speak with their local members about the importance of climate justice for our neighbours.
Right. And climate justice looks like what?
Well, for people in communities to be safe in their homes, to have a solid housing in Manila or in the outreaches of the Filipino Islands, so that with the regular and now inconsistent, I don't mean inconsistent, but unpredictable climate regime now. So more severe, more regular typhoons. In the Pacific, similarly. So the unpredictability of our climate globally impacts on the most vulnerable 100-fold compared to us here in Australia.
So when you're talking to locals in Australia, what are you leading them to do to help with this? What can people do?
Yeah, that's great. So we have an advocacy arm and their team, and they assist us with materials to really, our resources team give us the teaching resources or the community education resources to go out into the community to educate about climate change and the impact on the unjust impact on vulnerable communities around the world. And then our advocacy people help us to really get that message through to our governmental leaders at a local and national level and international level to advocate for a just climate. That is, a fair, the capacity of people to live a full and beautiful life where they are located, where their home is. So it involves a lot of knowledge giving to the Australian community. And they're very generous in that acceptance of that, given that they are also the donors to this work.
Yes. So that's there are other components to what you propagate as well, aren't there?
There is. Fundraising's really crucial, absolutely crucial, and our main fundraising time is during the 6 weeks of Lent, and we call that Project Compassion, and it's actually what many Catholic Australians know us for. However, we would love Australians to be involved with Caritas throughout the year, and there are many opportunities to advocate or push for change in the decision makers in our country, and to be enriched by all of the beautiful stories we have of hope and change in the 29 countries in which we work. So there are opportunities beyond fundraising to raise awareness and to advocate for change here in Australia. In fact, when I was in Timor-Leste last, they said, please go home and speak to your own government about our issues here. They are also quite politically savvy.
Yes, well they might be, because they're going to need to be, but that's another point.
It's another story.
It certainly is. Yeah. We're out of time. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back. You're watching Harmony and Diversity. We're speaking with Megan Bourke. She's the Community Engagement Coordinator for Schools and Universities for Caritas Australia. Caritas, it does a lot of good work. It's amazing what you're unfolding for us today. In the area we've been talking about, though, there's a propensity for natural disasters. What happens when there's a disaster? Are you involved in that?
We are. In fact, the organisation started in response to global hunger. But yes, we are ready and willing to respond to a whole range of natural disasters, and keeping in mind that they might be the ones that come upon us suddenly, like earthquakes, tsunamis, typhoons, cyclones and so on. But a natural disaster can also be a quiet, seeping one, like, like the drought in East Africa, which has been occurring over a period of years, but has now reached absolute crisis point. And it could be something like the gradual sea level rise. So natural disasters is a broad area, but we're ready to respond to all of those when they occur. So we might call them emergency aid or humanitarian aid. The media uses different phrases, but Caritas's donations are also spent on that purpose as well. So, for example, at the Nepal earthquake fairly recently, we were ready to respond. The Hurricane Irma and so on, ready to respond. And often we combine with other big NGOs to make that happen.
And that response being what, in kind or in articles of...
Yes, we can provide the funds for the in-country purchase of water, tents, emergency food supplies, and the rollout of all of those, plus the capacity of communities to reconnect. So often when there's a natural disaster, children and families or whole families are disconnected and need to find one another, communicate with one another that they're okay. So that as well as psychosocial support for traumatised peoples, particularly children. We need to get them back into school very swiftly in makeshift classrooms if we have to. We know that reduces their trauma after a big event. Of conflict or natural.
So we've covered quite a lot of the activities. Are there any that we've missed? Come to your mind?
I would like to emphasise that we work really strongly in partnership with our First Australian programs.
Okay.
And dear to all of our hearts, a really important component of Caritas Australia's work broadly is to focus on Indigenous communities around the world, because they're often marginalised because of an ethnic or religious political minority. But Indigenous communities in particular around the world don't have the same health and wellbeing outcomes that non-Indigenous peoples around the world. In our First Australian programs, we're very proud of their capacity to have improved their livelihoods in many different ways, shapes and forms. And I'd encourage your viewers to check those out, because there's economic programs and there's micro enterprises.
Yeah.
There's a whole raft of different ways in which our First Australians are improving their own life of dignity.
They're taking the responsibility. Is there anything to do with their connection with the land, their spiritual component?
Absolutely,
Yes.
and that in honouring their dignity, we honour that deep spirituality. There's a lot we can learn, isn't there?
Oh, there
So
certainly is.
and I think that's a really important component for all Australians to take on board. You can learn a bit about that. We have a fantastic website, great resources on our website that's
good.
worth visiting.
And is?
For general community knowledge, and also for teachers and students in schools. Our resources are extraordinary.
And it's Caritas Australia, is it?
www.caritas.org.au. It's probably
People-
here, actually.
Yeah, is it?
So we have a great quote from Pope Francis. He's a huge supporter of our work, obviously, particularly, well, in all aspects. You quite probably know that he has made comment in the past saying that he wants a church that is bruised and hurting and of the streets. He himself was a minister on the streets, and we focus a lot on Oscar Romero's work, for example, with children, to say, aspire not to have more, but to be more. An important message for children. But this is what we're on about, really, to restore dignity to every human person on earth and to offer hope.
Which gives an interesting connotation to charity. There's charities more about not money.
Well, charity is money. It might be giving goods or blankets or whatever, and that's absolutely essential. We need the Australian community to be charitable, because we have plenty relative to other communities around the world. However, the big work of Caritas is around justice, and we see charity as an expression of justice, that everybody, as I mentioned at the very beginning, Norm, that we see this float of justice throughout the scriptures, throughout our work and our traditions. And so our work for justice is, because it's the right thing to do for all human persons who are made in the image and likeness of God. So I would probably sum it up like this, that justice is the big long-term work. Charity is absolutely essential. We can't do the work without money or donations. But the bigger question is, why is poverty still in place? Why are there people in our global family that have less than we have, a less dignified life than we have? And we're working with people, walking beside them while they discover that. Now, the interesting thing is, you and I will work with compassion and love in our hearts. In fact, that's what Caritas means, love and compassion. With people we will never meet.
No.
But that's because we're drawn to make a justice response through our faith.
And there is no justice in time. And we're unfortunately out of it. And you have covered Caritas beautifully, and talking about beautiful, it's a very beautiful organisation which is doing a huge amount of good work, which is dependent on the generosity of Catholics in Australia.
It is.
And I think for them to hear what is done with their donations must be very encouraging. Thank you so much, Megan.
Oh, you're most welcome. Thanks for having me along.
It's a pleasure. You've been watching Harmony and Diversity. We'll be back next week, and thanks for watching.
Baha'u'llah, Shanti Om, Allah.